Hi everybody and welcome to a new video on the Mio Lesson channel. I'm going to talk about the Sony a7 IV again, but this time versus the Canon R6. And as usual, this episode is all about photography. The second part, which is about the video capabilities, will be available soon and you'll find the link in the description below. Ready? Let's get started. Here we have the two cameras, the a7 IV and the EOS R6, and these are the firmware versions they were running when I compared them, and they were the latest available at the time of making this video. The R6 is a bit larger and heavier than the a7 IV. Both cameras are built with a magnesium alloy chassis and are weather sealed. Concerning the design, the R6 is a bit more rounded and has a larger front grip. Also, the shutter button is higher and more sloped towards the front, which feels a bit more natural to reach. There is a good amount of physical controls, including the AF joystick on the rear, and I find the dials a bit easier to turn. The only button I'm not fond of is this one, the M function button. I find it a bit too small and not intuitive to reach when using the viewfinder. Even though I prefer the Canon ergonomics overall, I must say that Sony has made good improvements lately, and the A7 IV is more comfortable to hold than its predecessor. What's more, the Sony offers more customization. It has 12 custom buttons versus 8 on the R6, and you can also change the function menu and have two separate versions for still and video. Additionally, the A7 IV has an extra dial on top with a lock button. By default, it changes the exposure compensation, but you can assign another function to it. One thing, however, that only the Canon system offers is the possibility of customizing the function ring that is available on every Canon RF lens. Both cameras have the classic shooting mode dial on top, however, Sony decided to separate video by adding a smaller switch underneath so that you can change quickly between the photo mode, the video mode, or the S&Q mode, which stands for slow and quick motion. The menu systems are quite different, starting from the layout. The Sony version is very complete and might be slightly more intimidating at first, but I have to say that it is very well organized and so much better than the older interface. That of the Canon is clear and easy to navigate. I never had a real problem with it. The two cameras have a similar viewfinder when it comes to specifications. They provide good clarity and a fast refresh rate, so I have little to complain. They're also easy to use when wearing glasses. At the rear, we find a multi-angle 3-inch LCD. The R6 monitor has more resolution than the Sony. They are both touch sensitive and you can do various things like navigating the menu. On the R6, you can also access the quick menu or start video recording by touching the monitor. An interesting option on the A7 IV is that you can close the monitor to put the camera in standby mode, and when you open it again, the camera wakes up. Now let's talk about memory cards. The R6 uses two UHS-2 SD cards just like the A7 IV, but the Sony is also compatible with the CF Express Type A card on the first slot. The advantage of the CF Express card is better buffer when shooting in continuous mode and faster transfer speed when moving your images in your computer. It is also required when you want to record 4K 60p at the maximum quality with the S&Q mode. But if you don't have these specific needs, stick with the SD cards and you'll spare a big chunk of money. Then we have the ports on the side, microphone input and headphone output, HDMI output which is full size on the Sony and micro size on the R6, and a USB Type-C port which works at 10 gigabit per second on the Sony and 5 gigabit per second on the Canon. Next, we can talk about battery life, which is actually very similar overall between these two cameras. For example, I was able to capture nearly 2,600 photos of flying birds with the R6 and I had about 60% of battery left. The A7 IV performs on a similar level. A battery grip is available for each, and both cameras can be charged or powered via USB, but keep in mind that not every power bank will work on the R6. You need a high current charger specifically. One annoying thing is that the A7 IV comes without a battery charger in the box. You need to use the supplied USB adapter or buy an optional charger. Fortunately, there are a lot of third-party chargers that are less expensive than the official Sony one. And finally, a little curiosity. Sony has copied Canon and introduced the anti-dust function. When enabled, the shutter curtains cover the sensor when the camera is turned off. in order to protect it from dust when changing lenses. Canon introduced this idea with the original EOS R 4 years earlier. Keep in mind that the mechanical curtains are very delicate, and some users even recommend not enabling this function as they can be more easily damaged than the sensor itself. The two cameras feature a 35mm format sensor, also known as full frame. The S7 IV has more resolution, 33 megapixel to be precise, and it has a BSI design, meaning back illuminated design, which collects light more efficiently than the standard design from a technical point of view. The Canon has a 20 megapixel sensor and a low pass filter, whereas it is unclear if the Sony has a similar filter or not. There is a lot of contrasting information on the web. Judging from my own tests, I would say that if the Sony has one, it is very weak. Here is my first comparison, and you can see the difference in resolution when magnifying both images at 100%. In addition to the larger details, both the RAW file and the JPEG of the S7 IV are a bit crisper. Note that you can change various parameters to control image quality on the JPEG files, and that also includes sharpness. More megapixel can give you more room for cropping in post, or if, for example, you want to work in APS-C mode, the S7 IV will give you a 14 megapixel file versus 8 megapixel on the R6. Moving on to dynamic range, a demanding 4 stops recovery shows more noise in the shadows on the S7 IV file, but the R6 also has color artifacts in the darkest areas. With a 3 stops recovery, the results are more similar. The A7 still displays a bit more noise, but also has less color shift in the darkest areas. In the bright parts of the image, the amount of highlight preservation is the same. Concerning the type of image file, the A7 IV can shoot 14-bit RAW with 3 levels of compression: uncompressed, lossless compressed, or compressed. The R6 has 2 options: RAW, which is lossless, or CRAW, which is compressed. As you can imagine, the uncompressed option plus the higher megapixel count mean that the A7 IV files can be much bigger than those created by the R6. The ISO are slightly different between the two cameras as far as the normal range is concerned. And now is a good time to mention that the brightness is not the same when using equal aperture, ISO, and shutter speed parameters. The A7 IV is approximately half a stop brighter than the Canon, and that is something I've noticed also when comparing the R6 with the A7 Mark III. To make these side-by-side images easier to analyze, I try to equalize the exposure as much as possible. As expected, the Canon has less noise overall, and the difference becomes more noticeable from ISO 6400. If you like to work with JPEGs, both cameras have a noise reduction setting. If you leave noise reduction off, the S7 IV image has more color noise than the R6. If you set it to low or standard, color noise is gone on the Sony, but the Canon image remains somewhat cleaner. The R6 has 2 extra steps: the high level, which starts to reduce details a little bit, and the multi noise reduction mode that merges 4 images to improve the quality further. The latter gives you a good balance between low noise and sharp details, but it won't work well with moving subjects in your scene. Alright, let's talk about colors now, and here we see another interesting difference between these two cameras. With the same parameters applied to the RAW files, using the Adobe Color Profile in Lightroom in this case, the R6 image has more magenta, whereas the S7 IV has more green, and the same difference can be observed with the in-camera JPEGs. Each brand has its own set of picture profile that will affect the JPEG or the video files. They are called Creative Look on the Sony, and there are 10 of them. The Canon has 7 picture style. Let's take a look at a second example where we can analyze individual colors a bit better. you can see how the red of the apple is more vibrant on the Canon version, whereas the blue of the stone leans towards more cyan in the Sony image. This is valid for RAW, with equal parameters once again, and the standard JPEG profile. Most of the other profiles are quite different on each camera. For example, neutral on the 7.4 has less saturation than the R6 version, fine detail on the Canon has lovely vivid colors, whereas vivid 2 on the Sony increases brightness and clarity. With skin tones, the R6 has more red on the RAW file, and if we change to JPEG, the red dominance becomes more evident on the Canon. It becomes too strong for my taste on the portrait style, whereas the 7.4 maintains a more balanced look overall. The neutral style is my favorite on the R6 when it comes to skin tones, whereas that of the Sony lacks a bit of saturation with the default settings. Now remember that if you don't like a specific profile with the default settings, don't give up on it just yet. Each one of them can be tweaked with various parameters on each camera, including saturation, contrast, and more. For example, adjusting the color tone to +2 on the R6 reduces the reddish of the skin and gives you a better look in my opinion. Remember that these settings won't affect the RAW file. I'll conclude this image quality chapter with a quick overview on extra settings. The 7.4 has a soft skin effect mode, which is very subtle if you select the low level, but it starts to be apparent if you choose medium and becomes too invasive with the high level, which makes the portrait unrealistic. Concerning the auto white balance, the Canon tends to go towards a cooler rendering when you select white priority in comparison to the same setting on the 7.4. Finally, another option available on both products in addition to JPEG is HDR HEIF, which works in 10-bit as opposed to 8-bit. Keep in mind that this format is still not widely used, nor is it compatible with a lot of photo editor software. For example, Lightroom can't open them. The R6 can convert HDR files to JPEG in camera. With the Sony, you'll need to use the Imaging Edge software. The A7 IV features 759 phase detection points that cover 94% of the sensor. It also has 425 contrast detection points. The R6 has Canon's dual pixel CMOS AF technology with 100% coverage when tracking AF is used. Otherwise, it's 100% horizontal and 90% vertical with other AF methods. With a single AF method, there are more than 60,000 points available. With a tracking mode, 1053 errors are used. Both cameras have advanced algorithms with deep learning technology and they can detect faces, eyes, humans, and animals. The R6 can also detect vehicles, as in Formula race cars, rally cars, motorbikes, and so on. In single autofocus mode, which is called one-shot AF on the R6, the two cameras are fast and accurate. The R6 can feel a bit quicker and more reactive, whereas sometimes the 7.4 can take a slightly longer time to acquire focus, but this is a very small difference, so I wouldn't worry about it. Also, the performance can vary a little depending on the lens used. The R6 has an advantage in low light thanks to the greater sensitivity, which is one step better in comparison to the A7 IV. Additionally, the two cameras can use phase detection in continuous shooting mode down to f22, which means that the performance is not affected when using zoom lenses with slow apertures and teleconverters. In this sequence, there was only a weak LED light behind the TV in the living room and another small string of LED light in the kitchen under the shelves. The A7 IV only managed to take 9 photos. It was able to follow the person at the beginning, but then lost it completely until she arrived in front of the camera. The R6 managed 26 photos and was able to follow the subject all the way, but it didn't deliver a perfect sequence. With a 62% hit rate, it did better than the Sony for sure, but also struggled to refocus correctly at the end. It looks like the system got confused. Another thing I noticed is that the R6 often failed to detect the face and the eyes during the entire sequence, reverting to the normal tracking mode, whereas the S7 model was able to detect the eyes most of the time. What is curious is that in my A7 III versus R6 comparison, the Canon was capable of detecting the eyes in similar dark conditions with a slower lens, that was the RF 24-105mm f4. Perhaps the camera struggled more with the 85mm because they have a different AF motor, or maybe the various firmware updates changed something. Unfortunately, I didn't have the same set of lenses as last time to double check my findings. But the takeaway here is that the R6 is overall better, but not 100% reliable either. Let's have another look to face and eye detection, this time with better light conditions. The Sony gave me a very good keeper rate of 80%. It struggled a bit more when the subject walked backwards and when she turned. The R6 did better with a keeper rate of 86%. It's not a great difference, but the Canon struggled less when the person wasn't facing the camera. With a more static subject that only moves the head, both cameras do really well. If the person wears a hat, they do a good job of focusing on the eyes even when they are about to be covered by the rim of the hat. That said, the R6 can occasionally get confused and focus incorrectly for a few shots. Since publishing my 7.3 versus a 7.4 in-depth comparison, some of you asked me if I had focusing issues with the Sony when using eye autofocus, which seems to be a lack of accuracy affecting different users that reported the problem online, and the answer is no, I haven't. I took various portraits of my wife and a lot of pictures of my toddler without finding anything out of the ordinary. Of course, it's not always 100% accurate, but that is to be expected when using a fast aperture or even when taking pictures of a young child that never stops moving. Moving on, both cameras allow you to prioritize the left or right eye, which is very useful when taking portraits. On the A7 IV, you can do this with the help of a custom button. On the R6, you move the AF joystick left or right, and that also allows you to switch between two different people in the frame. The R6 can detect different parts of the body of animals and birds, including the face and the eye. If the subject is too far, it will concentrate on the body or the head depending on the distance. The S7 IV can only detect the eyes of animals and birds. It doesn't distinguish between body and head like the Canon does. If the eyes are not detected, it follows the subject with the tracking mode or another AF area you selected. I do recommend to use the tracking mode on the S7 IV. With the Sony, you need to select in the menu or via custom button which subject you want to track, human, animal, or bird. The camera won't switch automatically between them. On the Canon, you have to choose between humans and animals, and the animal setting also includes birds. Bird detection works really well. It helps to ensure that the eye of the subject is always in focus, as opposed to have the body in focus and the eye slightly soft when walking close to the subject. It also makes composition easier to manage because you don't have to move a small autofocus point manually with the joystick. It can also work well if the animal is partially hidden by a natural element, such as branches on a tree. However, it is better to start tracking the bird when the body is clear, if possible, otherwise the camera might miss focus on the nearby branches. Eyes are not always detected depending on the species. For example, the 7.4 struggles with ducks, unlike the R6. Moving on to my trusty red kites, both cameras deliver very similar results, and the best score I got with each model is almost identical. As usual, the green score includes sharp images only, the blue score includes sharp and slightly soft images. The average score includes different days I went to the red kite feeding station and or various settings combination I tried. You can find out more about my birds in flight test with a link in the description. In both cases, the tracking mode gave me the best result. Having IAF activated doesn't make a huge difference on the S7 IV. The camera rarely detects the eye unless the bird is really close to the camera. On the R6, I found that animals detection improves the keeper rate and it gave me the best result I just showed you. If the bird is not detected, which is rare, the camera uses the normal tracking mode, which is still very good. So far, I've only tested the S7 IV with the 200-600mm G lens, whereas I had the chance to use the R6 with three different lenses, the 100-500mm, the 600mm f11, and the 13 years old Canon EF 800mm 5.6 with the adapter. The camera gave me consistent results with all of them. Both cameras have various settings to control how the autofocus behave. I'm not going to show you all of them, but I wanted to explain that overall the A7 IV is easier to set up, and the only two extra settings you want to look at are AF tracking sensitivity and focus release priority. The R6 has more settings to offer, and some of them are quite advanced and not easy to understand at first. Among them, we find the Servo AF cases with 4 presets that can be edited with 2 different parameters: tracking sensitivity and acceleration deceleration tracking sensitivity. Basically, these settings allow you to refine the AF behavior depending on the type of subject you're photographing, how fast it is, and how predictable it is. Fine-tuning the Canon for the maximum performance can take more time in comparison to the Sony, but it's worth saying that even without the absolute best settings, the R6 maintains good performance and keeper rate. If you want to know more, you can find in the description of this video my guide to the best settings for wildlife and birds using the Canon R5 and R6. The two cameras offer 3 shutter modes: mechanical, electronic first curtain, and electronic. The maximum shutter speed available is 1/8000 of a second, regardless of the shutter mode used. When using the mechanical shutter, the R6 has a quieter shutter sound than the A7 IV, as you're about to hear. The R6 offers better drive speed. It can go up to 12 frames per second with the mechanical shutter or up to 20 frames per second when using the electronic shutter. These speeds are available with exposure and autofocus tracking. The A7 IV has a maximum of 10 frames per second, mechanical or electronic mode, with exposure and autofocus tracking. Note that the fastest drive speeds are not always available on the two cameras, depending on the settings. For example, the Sony works at 6 frames per second if you shoot with uncompressed or lossless compressed RAW. On the R6, various conditions such as cold, low battery, or a shutter speed that is slower than 1/1000 of a second can impact the drive speed as well. At 10 frames per second on the Sony or 12-20 frames per second on the Canon, live view is disabled and you see the last image taken in rapid succession. This gives you no blackouts, but what you are seeing is not live, but what just happened a few moments ago. Obviously, the faster sequence of the R6 at 20 frames per second gives you a smoother view of the action. At 8 frames per second and slower speeds, the two cameras show you live view with blackouts. The advantage of the electronic shutter is to take pictures in silent mode. Also, it doesn't affect the life cycle of the mechanical shutter, and additionally, in the case of the R6, it allows you to record with a faster burst rate. Using this function brings well-known limitations you need to remember. The first is the rolling shutter effect, where lines appear distorted when moving quickly with the camera. The R6 suffers visibly less from it, as you can see. Another problem with using the electronic shutter is banding, which is a series of horizontal lines that appear on your photos when working with certain type of light sources like LED. Sometimes it is very visible on the live view, sometimes you need to magnify the image to notice it. To eliminate this, the A7 IV has a setting called variable shutter, which allows you to adjust the shutter speed to a higher degree of precision than the default 1/3 step and match the same frequency of the light source. It is available for photo and video. In this example, you can see how choosing a speed of 1/64.2 of a second got rid of the problem. Note that the variable shutter might not always be 100% effective, so when you can, take a few test shots and check your images carefully. Finally, let's talk about buffer. The A7 IV can shoot at 10 frames per second for more than 30 seconds with compressed RAW or JPEG, as long as you use the CF Express card. If you use a SD UHS-2 card, the camera slows down after 5 seconds when using RAW and then continues at half the speed. The R6 maintains the full speed of 12 frames per second for about 20 seconds. Then it does something different than the Sony. Rather than slowing down the frame rate, it maintains the maximum speed but with pauses of 2 seconds. At 20 frames per second with the electronic shutter, the full speed of the R6 lasts for about 5 seconds, then there are 4 seconds long pauses between bursts. The A7 IV includes 5-axis stabilization with an official rating of 5.5 stops of compensation. The R6 offers on paper superior performance with 8 stops of compensation. Keep in mind, however, that the rating can drop down to 7.5, 7, or even 6 stops depending on the lens used. As usual, my test consists of taking 10 pictures for each shutter speed I want to try, and then I analyze how many images are sharp and how many have motion blur. As you can see, the R6 can manage a few shots with a shutter speed of 2 seconds, which is really good. The keeper rate improves from half a second and is perfect from 1/8 of a second. What is also interesting is that among the bad shots taken at 2 seconds and 1 second, none of them are extremely blurred. You really need to zoom in on the image to notice the lack of clear details. The S7 IV struggles with anything below 1/4 of a second. It is a minor improvement over its predecessor, but the performance remains very similar to older A7 cameras, including the Mark II model released in 2014, which was the first full-frame camera with 5-axis image stabilization. The 35mm lens I use with the R6 has optical stabilization, and at this point you may want to say to me that it's not a fair comparison since the Sony lens I use lacks optical stabilization. The quick excuse for this is that I didn't have a non-stabilized Canon lens or a stabilized Sony lens with me. But there is also something else to consider. Canon has designed its sensor stabilization system in conjunction with optical stabilization of its lenses. They are designed to work together, and most RF lenses are stabilized except for a few primes. Although the Sony sensor stabilization also works with optical stabilization, there are less Sony lenses with optical stabilization available, I guess because the brand thinks the internal stabilization of its camera is enough. There might be, of course, other reasons. That said, I can provide you with additional feedback because in 2020 I tested the R6 with the RF 50mm f1.2, which doesn't have optical stabilization. Compare with my results on the S7 IV using the Sony 55mm lens, this is what happens. The performance is more similar, but the R6 remains capable of better results with slower shutter speeds. It is also worth pointing out that the Sony lens with good optical stabilization like the 24-105mm f4 can improve the results a little. Here is the price for the two cameras, body only, and as you can see they are similar. Only with euros the Sony is more expensive. And remember, these prices are the ones available in early March 2022. Then we have the lenses, which is important to mention because we're talking about two very different systems. The Sony full-frame E-mount series started in late 2013, and over 8 years, the company has designed a superb range of lenses. Also, thanks to the support of third-party brands such as Sigma, Tamron, and more, there are now almost 100 lenses to choose from for every budget and need, and even more if you include manual focus lenses. Furthermore, Sony uses the same mount for its APS-C mirrorless series, which means extra versatility. The Canon RS system started in 2018, and Canon has developed no fewer than 26 lenses, which is fairly good. However, support from third-party brands is more limited as of now, and unlike Sony, Canon started from scratch by building a new mount and ignoring its EOS M APS-C mirrorless system. Canon EF DSLR lenses can be adapted on both cameras, but you need a third-party adapter for the A7 IV. I've tried several Canon lenses on Sony bodies in the past, and overall the performance is more than acceptable, but as you can expect, EF lenses are faster and more reliable on EOS cameras, also because Canon produces its own EOS R to EF adapter. It's the same family of camera body, adapter, and lens speaking the same language. The two cameras have extra functionalities. For example, the R6 can process raw images in camera, whereas you can use the A7 IV as a webcam with a simple USB connection, without the need of an additional plugin. I could talk more about all this, but I think my review is long enough as it is. I showed you all the most important things you need to know, so now it's time for my final verdict. In the conclusion of my 7 III versus R6 full comparison, I said that Canon had closed the gap and even outperformed the Sony in key areas such as autofocus and image stabilization. With the arrival of the A7 IV, the battle resumed, and part of my conclusion has changed. In terms of autofocus, the two cameras are on the same level now. You need specific situations to see a small advantage from one or the other, but overall they deliver an excellent level of speed, precision, and keeper rate. The R6 maintains an advantage with in-body image stabilization and continuous shooting speed. I also prefer the Canon ergonomics, although the Sony is much better than before and offers more customization. Concerning image quality, the main difference is the high resolution on the A7 IV, which adds a bit more noise at high ISO, but has nothing to fear when it comes to dynamic range. Last but not least, there is the excellent choice of lenses for Sony E-mount. I'm sure some of you also need to know how these two cameras perform with movie recording before making a decision, and that's why there is a second part of this review that is all about video capabilities. Once published, you'll find the link below in the description. I can say in advance that overall I find the S7 IV to be the better choice. It has better quality, more options for video makers, and it doesn't suffer from overheating as much as the Canon. So I can easily recommend the Sony if video is a priority for you, whereas with photography it's more difficult to find a clear winner in my opinion. And I guess that's it. Thank you for watching. I hope this video can be of help for you if you're hesitating between these two cameras. And as usual, don't hesitate to leave a comment if you have any question. And I'll see you soon. Thank you again. Bye bye.